All right, I think we're ready to go tonight for another World Building Wednesday. This might be the last World Building Wednesday for a little while, as I've gotten through a lot of the core material I wanted to cover, at least for this chunk. So maybe some seeing some more later, but we kind of reached a nice stopping point here with nations. Today we're going to talk about the various nations and cultures of your setting. So let's go ahead and tee that up. We actually had somebody in the chat room last time who complained that the settings we'd created here were monoculture, and that's not very realistic. You have a variety of cultures. And having thought about that, I kind of understand where that person's coming from, but it's based on some misconceptions, misunderstandings of what we're doing here. Excuse me. First off, a lot of people think that when you're creating a setting, that you're trying to be a simulation of reality, that you're trying to make something where every detail, every piece is this tightly integrated puzzle where, and not just puzzle, but like a clockwork mechanism where everything feeds off each other and works in this perfect orrery of, I think it's the right word, of just all this clockwork mechanism is all kind of working in perfect harmony. But it's rare for anyone to just create a setting ex nihilo. You've got a book to write, or you got a video game you're making, or you got some plan for this setting. Even if you don't, you're probably going to do something with this setting. If it's just notes you're writing for yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. But if it never goes anywhere, like what are you doing it for, right? It might be a hobby, it might be just something you're doing, and again, that's fine. But most of the time, these settings have some work that they plan to go in. And so your primary goal here is creating something that is effective for that work. So if you're writing a book, your setting needs to serve the purposes of your book. If you're making a tabletop game, a role-playing game, your world needs to be a place that makes it easy for people to have the kinds of adventures, the kinds of stories that you want your role-playing game to have, right? If you're making a game, but the setting doesn't really fit in with the kinds of stories that you want to tell, then you're kind of wasting your time, right? That's going to be an incompatibility. It's going to make the game less fun. Going to make your book less interesting. Great settings are tuned to the stories being told in those settings. Dune, one of the great classic sci-fi settings, is very much attuned to the themes of those stories. It's not just random that Arrakis is a desert planet with a very valuable resource that is mined, from it, and that where the native peoples are kind of repressed as a result of that, and these large powers come in. It's a metaphor for oil. And that setting is built around those things, around some of the other things being said in those books. Star Wars is this big, diverse setting because that's one of the ideas of being this big, epic story. So, you don't need to worry about your setting being realistic, right? You can have a monoculture world if you want to, but most people don't. The other issue people often have is that if you know that your setting is going to have 4 major cultures, and you go into world building with the mindset that you're going to define those cultures, you're no longer creating a setting. You're creating 4 settings, Right? You have to do all of these steps for all of those things simultaneously. You'll never get done. You know, it's very difficult to manage all of those things realistically. You know, for most people. So what is much more effective is to figure out what is the kind of the default culture. You know, how do people generally see certain aspects of the world? How do most people live, right? Or what are the general divisions in society? So a good example would be Europe, right? In our real world, particularly like medieval Europe, but really Europe in any age, there are absolutely strong differences in those cultures. But if you look at, you know, peasantry, nobility, king slash queen slash emperor, right? That social structure is very similar. Views on the family, you know, what is a peasant family, are pretty similar in France and Germany and Switzerland and Britain and Spain. There are obviously variations, but you can see a homogeneity there much more than you can in, say, China or Japan, right? So you can start by saying, okay, what is the kind of, again, the average culture? What do most people think, you know, regardless of cultural specificity about these certain aspects? Or you can define your starter culture, you know, your starter nation. If you're writing a book, where does that book take place? In what nation does that take place? What is your sort of viewpoint nation or viewpoint culture? You start there, and then you can define other cultures in contrast to that culture. Where you can say, okay, I now know how this nation works. How is this nation similar or different? And it's much more easy if you've done the work of defining that viewpoint culture. So there's two ways of going about it. We'll probably do each one here, because we have two different settings. We'll probably take each of these approaches and do one for one setting and one for the other. So what do you want to think about in terms of nations? There are a number of things here. I think one of the most important ones is climate and feeling. And by that I mean, again, sort of generically, how is one, you know, how does one nation feel? And again, you can contrast, say, the rolling fields of France with the high mountains of Switzerland, or the seasides of Italy. Now, obviously, each of these nations have rolling hills and mountains and seasides, potentially. But, you know, kind of what is that initial reaction you would have when you think of that country? What is the dominant climate, the dominant, you know, element there? And then what are the feelings of those things? So again, you think of mountains, and you can contrast the mountains of Switzerland with the mountains of Eastern Europe, those sort of you know, the foreboding Dracula Gothic sort of areas, the places that are, you know, that feel very foreboding. Same basic, you know, features, but a different feel. And so I think what are the dominant landscape types that people think of when they think of this nation, and what are the dominant feelings around those? And feelings can also include things like, is it lush? Is the soil good? Is it easy to grow vegetables? Is it hard to do that? You know, the Alps are a great example where there's a lot of tending of animals, because animals can live on those very steep slopes that are not as good for a lot of vegetables. And so you have to more carefully plan like vegetable and fruit gardens compared to the, like, again, to the rolling countryside of the lowlands. And this is one of the interesting things, is that because you have a variety of climates and a variety of environments, it's not that you will never see any other environments. You don't want a nation that is all mountains, it's all sharp mountains. But people tend to have dominant feelings about a particular aspect of a nation, a particular aspect of a nation's geography. And then you want to start thinking about resources. What is abundant and what is scarce? People often go very simplistic on this, where it's like, this nation needs gold and that nation needs sheep. And so they trade the two back and forth. It's like, well, you can go there. But it's often a lot more interesting to think a little bit more abstractly. Power. Workforce. Spirit. Right? In the sense that one nation might be very forward-thinking, independent, and inventive, while the other culture may be more laid back and relaxed and kind of not quite one with nature necessarily, but even just more chill, right? And those can very much define them. And so if that more chill culture is suddenly threatened by new technology, that can very easily create a strong tension between the two. Maybe they need to import some folks from the first nation. Stuff like that. So you can kind of think about those things. They can be sort of mental resources as well as anything else. And it's important to think about what does a current culture have a lot of, or relatively large amount of, and what is scarce. And also, nations don't trade of one for the other is dramatically boring. I'm going to make that a sub-bullet. Meaning, again, if one culture is has a lot of timber, and another culture has a lot of cows, and you say, well, the one that has a lot of timber needs a lot of cows, the one that has a lot of cows needs a lot of timber, so they're constantly trading. That's dramatically boring. Or it can be. It's much more interesting if there's a third resource, if they both need something that another nation has, and they're both trying to get it, right? Also, things rarely work out that way, right? If two neighboring nations rarely have diametrically opposite needs and resources. They're usually more complementary. So again, you can have a variety of things, but don't just have this simple sort of board game style constant trading back and forth. And even if you do that, you have basically a static society. And that can be interesting if you want to explore that idea of cultures that have this perfect flow. But economic theory shows us that tends to normalize after a while. Somebody figures out how to plant trees and the other, or how to, raise cows in some way and kind of ease that imbalance. So it's an important thing to think of. Every nation tends towards a state of war with other nations. I'm putting this in quote. A dramatically useful way of thinking about conflict between nations. This is a principle that's been raised in sort of theory about different cultures and essentially socio-political theory. And I want to credit Matt Colville on YouTube for this, for pointing me to this. The idea is that the natural state of any nation is war, and it takes a lot of effort by politicians and such people to prevent that war from happening. If nobody does anything, nations naturally devolve, if you will, into a warlike state because resources are finite. Because if you have expanded to your borders, People tend to have children, and you generally tend to need more and more resources. And even if you don't have a lot of children, you tend to have more prosperity as you're growing. And so you'll reach those limits, and then you need to grow somehow. And in most of these settings, folks are not growing technologically, so you have to grow geographically by invading other nations. Or, some resource will be a dramatic deficit that you can take by invading another country. Also, it's kind of an easy win, if you will. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that theory, and you don't have to either. This is the important thing. You may be hearing this and thinking, I don't like that. But it's a very useful principle to think of when you are creating a setting and when you're defining your nations, to essentially ask yourself, what would drive these nations towards war? I should think of these nations as having certain elements to them that would naturally cause somebody to go to war over those elements, those resources, those conflicts, and so forth. In other words, every nation should have some reason to go to war with pretty much any other nation on the map. Even if it's a silly reason, even if it's a kind of an out there reason, because that generates drama. That creates a more interesting setting, and it creates a setting that provides potential for other stories. People love settings where even when you're finished, reading the book or playing the game or what have you, you're now imagining other things happening in that setting. And you can imagine yourself in that setting. Those potentialities for the conflict between nations is one of those ways of really spicing up your setting and making it feel bigger than the work it's in. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. Every nation should have some reason to go to war with any other given nation. And obviously it'll be different for different nations. Some nation will have pretty much the same reason for others. Some might have a completely different reason for each nation, but helpful way of thinking things. Also, I think I mentioned this before. Think of similarities and differences. Neighboring nations are rarely completely different. There's usually a lot of cultural flow between the two. So don't just go whole hog and make each one completely different. But also don't make them exactly the same. There should be some middle ground there. Also remember that what were the national boundaries before? Right. The current boundaries of this nation have not probably been the same for the past 1,000 years. Nations have come and gone. So thinking through those elements of where do these nations come from? Where did these peoples come from? Where did these people come from, right? This is probably not the cradle of civilization, so what were those patterns like? What peoples did they come in contact with? Did they drive them out? Are they still there, right? Is there a native culture that is still there that was kind of overwhelmed by this new culture, and maybe they were wiped out? Maybe there are still some folks around. Those are all kind of interesting things. They may have been absorbed. So we know that culture exists, but they didn't really go anywhere, and they didn't really preserve that culture in a really strong form. But there are bits of it still around in culture. Were natives driven out, absorbed, kept distinct? Right? You start thinking about cultural traditions that may have stayed around or evolved. Perhaps there is a religious practice that the invaders brought with them that then absorbed aspects of the native religious practices, and that changed it. So there are elements of both the native and the foreign religious practices still there. Maybe that's a source of conflict. Maybe there's a splinter group that doesn't like how those religions have merged and want a purity one way or the other, want to go back to how things used to be. And we often, by the way, tend to think of that as this this bad religious fundamentalism, but that's Protestantism, right? Many religions have had periods where someone comes in and says, hey, you've gone way far in this direction and it needs to be reined back in. And obviously this isn't just religions as well. Any given faction, any given approach to things can go off the rails, and someone can come in and say, no, we need to pull back to sort of basic principles. So you can go that in multiple different directions. Maybe this new religion has gotten really abusive, and someone's like, no, we need to change things around. Who knows? There's lots of options there. And again, it doesn't have to be religion. It could be a guild, right? It could be a cultural practice. It could be marriage ceremonies that have gotten really, really complex and really intricate and expensive, where people aren't getting married because of all of these rituals and requirements around it, and so there are all these undocumented marriages all over the place, and that's created this difficulty in keeping track of people. We don't know how many people are in these given areas because nobody's documented, and that's not just a control thing. It's like, well, we have large groups of people who may suffer, who may have bad things happen to them, and we don't know about it because there's no way of counting how many people there are there. People say there was a disaster here. It's like, oh, well, some people may have been hurt, or we don't know how many people are there. So it's those sorts of things, right? Where anything can have these bad effects. Okay, so I think we get the idea there. So you want to think about the differences and similarities between different nations and different cultures, and obviously I'm using cultures and nations interchangeably here because I'm assuming for the purposes of this that every nation we are defining the dominant culture for any given nation, and then we can always subdivide that. So it's sort of a fractal, right? Right now we've only defined kind of the general culture, the common culture, or perhaps the viewpoint culture. And now we're going to define other geographic cultures or other subcultures in there. And then once we define that, we could go in and define subcultures within each of those and figure out all those bits and pieces. But for now, and again, because geography does tend to define culture to a great extent, where geographic boundaries will tend to isolate people and thus create cultures, it's usually most sensible to kind of start with geographic nations. But you could just go culture, because it'll definitely depend. So those are things to think about. Let me think if there's anything else I wanted to bring up at this point about nations in a world like this. Then there's the boring stuff. How is it ruled? How big is it? What are its biggest problems? In other words, is it a monarchy? Is it a democracy? Is it an oligarchy? Lots of different options there. Is it a giant nation or a small nation? And what are those big conflicts that it's facing right now? What are the stress points? Are there revolutions in the making? Is a certain class rising or falling dramatically? Is there some geographic or environmental problem? Have the rains just not been coming? Has a dragon moved in and is sucking the life out of the energy or the life out of the land? What's going on? Or is it the opposite? Are things going really well and that's created a lot of stress? Is there a lot of prosperity all of a sudden, and so there's lots of money going around, and folks are spending that lavishly. And so the culture is getting kind of weird and out of whack because people are getting very greedy, or they're getting very ostentatious, and they're wasting money. And over the course of generations, folks are just kind of making money and then spending it immediately, and not really setting themselves up for a solid future. And so the children are destitute. All those sorts of things that can happen as a result of sort of over success, if you will. So it's worth thinking through all of those things, because again, that adds drama, it adds conflict, and it suggests plot points. If you're struggling with your story, often it's because, or often that can be resolved by digging deeper into your setting, and thinking through those problems in the setting that can create characters that have problems, that create villains, antagonists, folks who are striving towards ends that are opposite your protagonists, but for understandable reasons, right? They don't just like kicking puppies all day. They have this agenda, and that agenda just happens to conflict with the protagonist, and these things can often be that. And if your setting supports all those, then it will all feel natural. It'll all feel like a natural outgrowth of your story and what you're trying to do and trying to tell. All right, so there are our principles. Let's look at our settings. So we have our post-apocalyptic verdant Utopia. This is a Bronze Age, again in the general sense, because this is actually post-apocalyptic, but that sense that people are not using iron, steel, etc. Those are left behind in the ruins. People really don't know how to use them, and they're not readily available, right? You can't just break off a piece of steel and use it in general. It's part of this building. It's part of this abandoned car. And so, yeah. But plants have kind of taken over, and there are just vines and creepers and bushes and trees, and it's this sort of jungle environment with all of these plants taking over. People live, live in these caravans that travel from place to place, sort of harvesting wild berries and fruits and vegetables from all these areas, primarily like fruit and such. And then traveling from that to various essentially vegetable patches here and there, and farms here and there, that then provide those vegetables, and that's how most people live their lives. And so I think in this case, what we've defined here is something of a standard culture. In other words, I'm thinking most people in the known world live pretty much like this, and now we can start defining specific variances to that culture in different areas. So we know magic is basically hedge magic. It's small, controlled, low-power magical effects. Many people can do it. It's not inherent. Anyone can cast magic, but it taxes the mind and creates physical exhaustion. A lot of personal marks to mark private property. Migrant people. Many gods served by one priesthood, so we have that sort of central priesthood going through fatalistic culture. We have rangers wandering around exploring the more dangerous areas of the world that are extremely overgrown and have like man-eating plants and things like that. And deep sea fishing and such. Large families. Adulthood sex, just kind of nothing too notable there, I don't think. Justice. So we have these really small sort of microcultures in terms of each caravan. And so one of the questions could be, we could create separate cultures for each caravan, right? But I think that's a little hard to grasp. So I think instead what we're going to do is we're going to divide up caravans by city, in the sense that you have the ruins of a major city and the caravans that kind of travel around and near that, and how they differ from the caravans near another major city. And for simplicity's sake, there are lots of other things here. Through nations, not nationas. So I'm not going to try to model this specifically off, New York City versus Chicago, right? I'm not going to try to tie this to a specific real world place, but I think it would be helpful to imagine a couple of different sort of climatic regions, a couple of geographic regions that would be close. So we're going to say there is a caravan, there is one caravan culture that orbits a city on the sea, and another that orbits a city on a lake. You generally tend to have cities on or near major sources of water. And what I'm thinking here, by the way, is New York City versus Chicago. Actually, I just realized that came into my mind, but it's obviously not the same thing because those are so far apart. Those caravans would never get a chance to actually see each other. So, but this gives us an idea. The sea culture. Let's see here. And we're gonna assume. So here's how it's gonna be different from New York City. It's gonna be in a much more warm area. The sea city is in a very warm area. So people wear even less in the way of clothing. So not naked or anything necessarily, but just bathing suit sort of scale stuff. And we'll say in compensation, they tend to tattoo or paint their bodies. Although I think we said that the priesthood tattoos themselves. No check. Taboos. Children. Body modification, piercing, elongation body parts. Okay, so you have body modification there, so piercings and such, but not really tattoos. So that's cool. Or paint their bodies. So that's awesome. Their diet tends more towards seafood. And we also had a note up here about fishing. Deep sea fishing. It's so dangerous that they do it to form their own subculture. Okay, cool. And then did we have a thing here? I don't think we did. No, not a particular thing. So, cool. Seafood. So these are folks who will go down to the seaside and do seaside fishing, but not like deep sea fishing. They have a long-standing agreement with the deep sea fishing culture, and as a result are generally more tolerant of different viewpoints and cultures. So a little more open to different, strange things. I think the deep sea fishing culture might be just really strange. Almost wild and naturalistic. Very little in the way of strong grounded things because they're always on the sea, and so they may not have a lot of specific things. So we'll think about that. And so then let's say the lake city has rather dangerous wild plants and animals around it. So the caravans tend to be more socially conservative, we'll say, in the sense that they have to be more careful. Right? It's a dangerous place, and so it's a little harder to it's a little harder to get around. It's harder to break out of your normal route. It's hard for them to break out of their normal caravan routes. So strangers are relatively rare. That's cool. As a result, they venture into the abandoned city more often than most. So they're a little more tolerant of exploring the abandoned city environment. So most caravan wagons have some ornament scrounged from the city. That's kind of neat that you'll have maybe a license plate or a car hood ornament or a street sign, hanging off or on the front of, or maybe a lantern or something. Maybe even like a headlight hanging off the front of a caravan wagon or on the side of a caravan wagon, which would just look kind of weird in other caravans. Why would you bother with that? In fact, we'll say at least a few. Oops, sorry, hit the wrong button there. There we go. Have at least a few ornaments, city, hanging off the wagon's eaves. So almost this peddler's cart idea of these bits and bobs from the city sort of dangling off each caravan. We might even say children. About half of these are retrieved by children. A common rite of passage among children is to venture into the city to retrieve one of these ornaments. Very much not approved by the adults. I'll just say this is the common rite of passage. So maybe all of these are retrieved by children over time. So when you're 10, 11, maybe you would work up the courage to go in and find this all on your own, in the city alone. One of these ornaments. Cool. Let's say a few ornaments, license plates, headlights, street signs, etc. I like that. Just a little more eclectic. Again, a little more sort of peddler vibe there. Wonder if they'd use any technology from the city. Probably not. But they would be a little more tolerant of those people who live in those ruins or who explore those ruins professionally. That'd be kind of interesting. I like the idea of the deep sea. My mind is start working on the deep sea fishing culture, so maybe I'll go there next. But let's think about this a bit more. So how would religion be a little different, maybe? So what do we talk about? Actually, I'm looking right. Indentured servitude, quite common for short periods. Slavery, short-term punishment for crime. But they're basic human rights. Basic right to freedom of movement, very important. Basic right to food, particularly forage, from gathering wild food. I'm thinking this might be a little more common. So I think so maybe what we'll say here is that slavery as crime punishment is very common here, and has become So much so that some are uncomfortable with the number of convicts. I don't know what you call those actually. Convicts traveling with the various caravans. Maybe it's kind of gotten out of hand. Whereas over here, I'm thinking crimes are punished by banishment, not indentured servitude, not slavery, which is considered barbaric. Punished by, well, actually, we'll say by usually want some punishment for a crime that involves labor to the community. Hey, I'm here. Banishment or dangerous forays into the abandoned city or slash wild areas. Slavery is considered barbaric and not used as a punishment. Cool. So if you commit some major crime, you're, you atone for that by doing some really dangerous missions for the community, or you're just banished straight up. That kind of makes sense. Then of course you'd obviously have flogging and things like that. Physical corporal punishment, but probably nothing too crazy beyond there. I'm just gonna say the deep sea fishing culture is wild almost to the point of appearing barbaric. Minimal to no clothing, unkempt hair, savage, ecstatic religious rituals, etc. It's actually a complex culture, but seems very radical to the to outsiders. I like it. And again, if you're deep sea fishing all the time, why would you wear clothes? For that, you're among your own people. There's no one else around. Why would you wear a swimsuit, or if you find someone in a swimsuit, other than protection, of certain sensitive bits. So you might have like a loincloth, that kind of thing. But beyond that, I think you'd have very people just would not be very modest in this society. And you can have kind of very wild, emotional, sort of a society. Wild and emotional. So maybe they really they highly value strong emotions and personal experiences, right? So life is to be lived in the moment. All right, so there's our first setting. Let's move on to our second setting, the communist ranches. So the world of 1,000 islands, ranches, people living on these ranches in these really small communities. So we have obviously these different islands become very clear places. And it's funny, I remember thinking about this a lot and starting to come up with some ideas. Ranches have libraries, literacy, mages, human rights. So I'm thinking so we're going to say nations. Keep doing that. The main island has its own conservative, traditional culture, not handed down, but not evolved, derived from the old empire that united the islands many centuries ago. So it's like old Rome, right? You have that kind of those kind of cultural artifacts and those aspects sort of passed down over the generations. And still a pretty dominant power because of all the technology coming out of there. So I'm thinking, and we also already defined that there's going to be a sort of a sailor's culture, where sailors generally, while islands do have sailors, there's kind of evolved this distinct culture for sailors who live for years and years and years on the sea. But I think we're going to have, there are, initially I was going to say there are like 4 major factions, but I don't think it's helpful to start with a bunch of different things and then try to fill in all those numbers. I think it's better to say, okay, there's this thing, and then this in opposition to that, and then this in opposition to these, kind of build out from there. A group of islands nearby have established a federation, because they fear the growing power of the center of the main island. Right? It was this former power. Now it has all this technology, and so several of the bigger islands, group of larger islands near the main island. So I think those are going to be a significant power block. I also like the idea. We mentioned that there are these wild mages, and so I think that might be it. One island is famous for its tall mountains and is the traditional place where, do we call them mages? Because this is the setting where magic has to come through a familiar that you can corrupt. Familiars. There's possessive. I call them spellcasters. We'll just go with that. So where spellcasters bond with familiars. And so we'll say maybe 80% of spellcasters find their familiar here. This island has also become, as a result, become a haven for spellcasters, and is a power block in its own right. You have all of these spellcasters who are at least training here, at least getting used to their familiars here, and quite a few of them will stay on the island, right? And so it's probably a mageocracy. It's a mageocracy. So the most powerful wizards, spellcasters, run things here basically. And maybe there's like an election or something, but it's the basic idea is that it's a very magically controlled island. Mageocracy. Not that everyone here is a spellcaster, but that's a very dominant force in the island, and they kind of maintain that power. They make sure that they're not going to get bullied by other people. They may even like use magic to protect the island, to set up wards around the island, to create storms if invaders try to come through and wreck their ships. In fact, we'll say that about 100 years ago, a fleet attempted to attack the island, over the island, and the spellcasters, maybe 200 years ago, and the spellcasters came together to create a storm that destroyed the fleet. Let's make it a little no, maybe even earlier. Let's do it more recent. About 50 years ago. I don't know. We'll make it 70 years ago because that is a lifetime, basically. I'm gonna assume. So the people who did that are dead. But it was recent enough that so it's not in living memory anymore, but it's not so far in the past that you can just forget about it, right? That it's just kind of this distant memory. It was a real thing. There are still wrecks on the bottom of the harbor. That kind of idea. Since then, there are still wrecks scattered on the sea floor around the island. Since then, the island has been a majocracy ruled by the 13 most powerful spellcasters who choose to stay on the island. That makes sense. Where if you're really powerful, you can leave, and then it's not your responsibility. If you decide to stay, you kind of have to help protect it and defend it. That's kind of nice. So now we need to figure out culture. This island is more insular and distinctive in its culture. And we're just going to go ahead and say it. It does not, in fact, we'll say a fleet from the main island, or the magic island. We do need names for these at some point, which we can figure out. It does not import any firearms or technology from the main island. Partly out of in other words, they kind of don't trade with the main island, basically, because of that bad blood between them. So that's cool. How else would they be different? There probably wouldn't be a lot of ranches on here. There would be a few. So the ranches on the island there would be spellcasters working on them. Why not? Right? Just because you're a spellcaster doesn't mean you wouldn't work for your food. You can't just wander around and be a spellcaster for your living. So we're gonna say, ironically, magic is relatively mundane on the island. So many spellcasters settle down on ranches. However, since magic can be used to can it be used to make food? Can you magically summon an animal that you can then eat? That seems simple. That seems like it would just create more problems than it would solve. In the sense that, okay, now why doesn't everyone do this? Why would anyone, raise animals from scratch when you can just, create sheep and then eat it? So we will say, magic cannot create life. But we're also going to have some non-spellcasters there. So what would that mean? Would that create second-class citizens? It might. People are going to live with each other. So I'm going to say there is there is some tension between spellcasters and mundanes that varies considerably from ranch to ranch. So in some cases, it doesn't really matter that much. In some cases, there's a certain amount of, they look down on each other. And in some cases, it's, people get really upset over that. People get really, they really define themselves by being either a spellcaster or they, none of that here, please. So I like that as kind of an interesting thing. Ranch to ranch. We'll also say spellcasters, in most places, spellcasters only marry other spellcasters. Only have children with other spellcasters. So there's a sense of eugenics there, a sense that we will breed more powerful spellcasters in our children if we, if two spellcasters have kids together. But it's not. But notice, I'm not saying that's necessarily true. It's not necessarily factual that happens, but that's probably a sense. In the belief that they will breed true, so to speak. Slightly creepy, term breeding to use with people, but you get the idea. What other aspects? How would the ranches be different? I think not too much. You will say teenage walkabouts. So what happens when you reach an age, say early teen years, where you want to find a spouse, you want to break away from your parents, you go on a little walkabout from ranch to ranch, scoping out other teenagers your age, trying to get an idea of somebody you might want to settle down with, and then maybe going back to your own ranch or settling there, whatever. And so you have this sort of great mixing of teenagers around. So we'll say teenage walkabouts often coincide with seeking your familiar. So as part of your walkabout, you also search for a familiar. You also try to find you get in touch with your magic side. That's kind of interesting. So I think you get the idea here. So we could go into each of these cultures. What's the exact traditional culture of the main island? What is the culture of this federation? But it's this kind of stuff. It's looking at those basics of the culture, and then getting specific about how it's different in that particular area. Maybe it's not that different. Maybe these cultures are fairly uniform, or maybe they're really wildly different. You can certainly do that. But you get the idea. So that is nations and cultures in your world. Like I said, you can then go fractal. So on a particular island, you might have multiple different cultures on that island that you can work with and look at subcultures and such, and people reacting to culture, overculture, things like that. But I think that will do it for us for now. So hope you found this useful. Thank you for watching, and a bunch of other videos about this on this topic up on the YouTube channel and on geekarchaeology.com. And so if you're looking for more about this, I got a bunch of other videos on the topic, so various aspects of world building. So thank you for watching, and until next time, make something.